It's really good to be here. I feel like I'm learning lots of stuff from Johns Hopkins. Last time I was here, Greg reminded me that I talked about his stuff. And this year I'll talk about some of Munya's stuff. So I'm not trying to steal everything from Johns Hopkins, but there are a lot of good people here, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm trained as a signal processor, but I've been doing auditory perception in modeling, both in industry and academia for my entire career. I've been very lucky. But I'd like to start off with this slide because many years ago I was at a binaural workshop, and we had all the best people in the world at binaural hearing there. And whenever anybody asked a very hard question, we talk about it for a few seconds or a few minutes, and then someone invariably would raise their hand and say, we can't do that, that's the C word. And for this group, the C word meant cognition and cortex. So 10, 15 years ago, whenever this workshop was, actually, I don't know when it was. Whenever this workshop happened, the C word was evil. I mean, C word was really hard. We didn't know how to deal with it. We didn't know how to deal with it. And as an engineer, I was very sympathetic to that point of view because, how can you talk about cortex when we don't even know how the cochlea works, or inferior colliculus, or anything like that? And as I've gotten older and as the science has progressed, it's become more and more important to start to think about how the cortex works and cognition works, because the things we want to do really depend on understanding how that works and taking that into account. So I've done a lot of stuff. I'm not actually a pure speech recognition person. I've been close to those people for a long time. But I mean this in terms of general recognition, prosody, pitch, sound classes, anything at all. There's going to be both things driving perception from the bottom up, things that are salient, and expectations from the top down. And this is the simplest possible cartoon. And I'm here to convince you that this is wrong because it really looks more like this. There's this feedback loop going on that your expectations drives your perceptions and what's salient and all that kind of stuff. And it's a really messy problem. And it's especially hard because it's really hard to know how this thing works because, it's a loop. And unless you can break the loop, you can't really, diagnose the loop. You really can't say anything about how the loop is working. And so a lot of what I've spent the last maybe 10 years has been trying to figure out how do you break the loop in interesting ways? How do you understand what's salient? How do you understand what attention is doing? How do you understand the science so you can build better machines? And so today's talk, I'll talk a little bit about the motivations for this, both from a scientific and engineering point of view. And I'm going to start with the applications, just again to motivate this. As I said before, I've had this wonderful career doing both engineering and science. And I prefer the science, but I prefer the salary from the engineering world. And so I like to combine the two. And so far, my corporate sponsors have been happy to let me have this fiction going. And that's been fun. I want to talk a little bit about the theories involved in some of this, some of the work at Johns Hopkins and some elsewhere, again, to provide context. And then, if we have time, there's some really interesting results from some work we did in Telluride this summer on decoding deep neural networks. And it's so new, I don't even know how to talk about it yet. So I've got a couple slides, and if we have time, I'll talk about it. And maybe you guys will have some interesting questions that I can use to help guide the work. But that's if there's time and interest. So why do we care about attention? It's a really important problem. And I'd like to start with this video. This is probably all older than most of you in this room, or a lot of you in this room. Bill Gaver was at Apple late 80s, early 90s, and he did this system called the Sonic Finder. And this is a video talking about it. And hopefully all the technology works. Okay, I just want to give you a flavor for this. This is very old, obviously. And people loved it. I mean, it went around the company. I was at Apple all the time. It went around the company within hours. And this is before Facebook and things like that made it easy. So, it was really quite striking how people loved it for a very short amount of time. And the reason it was so wonderful was that it gave you feedback what you're doing. So you're doing things, you get feedback, and tactile feedback on keyboards is important. And having this higher level feedback on your operating system was good because it told you were doing the right things. But then the bad news was it was really hard to set the audio level in a way that didn't distract you. So for the first 5 minutes, you loved it because you played this, you did something and you got this feedback and you said, oh, good, it worked, and you didn't have to pay attention so much to the visual side. You could be doing other things. You got this feedback. But at the time, it wasn't possible for Bill to set the audio levels at the right level to make it non-distracting. So if you're doing these things, you want to get feedback. You want to know it's there, but you don't want it to be so loud that it distracts you. And he had no way of doing that. And so after 5 minutes, it's like, oh God, turn this off. And with changing audio environments and people coming in and out of the rooms, and you're changing tasks and using all that stuff, this was just impossible. But I think it was a really great idea. And this failed because there was no model of attention. There's no model of saliency. And we can do that now. I mean, at this level, we could do this if we wanted to do it again. And so that's, I think, is a fun part of this. When I was at Microsoft, we were pursuing this vision where the dominant UI paradigm was going to be a big screen or a screen of some sort of voice. So you're all carrying a screen around with you, at least one. But typing on these things is kind of a pain. So really, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to speak to this thing, and get feedback back from the display of some sort. And in order to make that work, there needs to be some sort of attention model to this. So you have to know, are you attending to this or are you attending to something else? And so we spent a lot of time looking at attention signals and how can we make speech recognition better by knowing what you're doing. So either looking at the screen or doing something else. And I'll talk about some of those results, and that was kind of fun. So again, it's visual output and speech input. More short term, the people that do hearing aids would dearly, dearly, dearly love to know whether the person wearing the hearing aid is listening to speech or music or attending to speech or music. So they would change the signal processing depending on speech processing or music processing. So just that one bit of information would make their products a lot better. And so they would dearly love to know what you're attending to. The same with different speakers. Are you listening to the person on the left or the person on the right? And people have done beamforming, but it'd be nice if you point your chest around. But it'd be nice if you could get some signal from the user that would tell them what voice to attend to and do something useful there. And then more recently, these new devices are out there that are essentially audio-only devices. And they solve the attention problem by having a hot word. So you say Alexa, or you say hey Google, and it responds to you. And then it asks you a question, and then are you supposed to say hey Google again, or is just it's going to respond to the next speech it hears? So these devices would really love to know what the human is attending to and doing that better. And I think it's interesting because it didn't show up very well. When this was first announced by Google, and I don't know why, I guess Amazon had different issues, but when first advertised it by Google, one of the stock analysts at the quarter or the annual report, quarterly reports or whatever, said, "But how are you going to show advertising in this thing?" So, I mean, it's kind of a funny joke, but it showed that the stock analysts realized that this is going to be popular enough that it can threaten Google's advertising model. So, these kind of things are coming. We've got 3 of them in my house, and they're useful, and they want to know when you're paying attention to them. And hot words are kind of a lousy solution. I mean, they work, but we'd like to do better than that. So I want to talk a little bit about some attention models we did. This is some stuff that we did in Telluride a few years ago. I guess Mooney was helping at the time. And we wanted to build a system that could in real time attend to conversations. And it was a toy solution in all senses of the word, but we wanted to have the whole system working in real time so we could talk about the different pieces. So you have this poor soul in the middle of a room trying to listen to speech. And we abstracted this into this problem with 2 speakers. And we wanted to build a model of is our subject listening to the female or to the male? And the general speech recognition problem is hard, especially when it comes to attention. So we abstracted the problem into numbers. And so Hennick's going to listen to the Hennick's going to be listening to the conversation, trying to pick out the high value speech. It might be the recipe last night, it might be dinner tomorrow, it might be some grant, it might be some gossip, whatever's going on. He's got some model for value. And we can't, it's really hard to model that. So instead what we did is we converted it into numbers. So, missing the slide yet. So we just had these 2 speakers speaking numbers. And our subject's task was to pick the sentence that had the highest value, where value in this case was just the numerical value. We're not trying to evaluate food or dating or anything like that at all. And so these 2 speakers are speaking numbers. And we wanted to build a model for how well can we model this ability to select the high value conversation. And for those of you who have been at Telluride, it's a grand exercise in how much work can you get done in 3 weeks, which is both good and bad. But in 3 weeks you have to dramatically simplify the problem, and so we actually got something that worked, which I thought was pretty cool. Excuse me. This is a system we built. It combines a bunch of things into a real system. We had some binaural technology, so we're doing binaural processing into a receiver that was done with a chip, and we built something that we called a salience detector, which was just looking at binaural salience. Is something happening over here or something happening on the right? And so that was very simple. And then we had a very simple ASR engine recognizing the speech. And in this case, this is how simple it was. It was just a MATLAB function looking at template matching. But that was good enough for this task. But there's these 2 very important signals. One was this salient signal saying, oh, there's something new happening over here. Pay attention over here. And the other thing was this attention model from the cognition box coming down and saying, okay, pay attention over here because this is where I think the high value stuff is. And so we actually built this system. We got it to work. As I said before, the semantic signal was abstracted into these numbers. So we're ignoring emotion. We're ignoring words. We're just saying which numbers are bigger. The saliency we abstracted into just binaural signals. So is there something new happening over here? Something new happening over here? Muni's got much better saliency models now. But at the time, that was something we could do easily. And we got that to work. Speech recognition was just, it says DTW, but I think it was actually just pattern matching. I don't think we even did dynamic time warping. And the language model we had was just odd and even digits. So every sentence ended with a even digit. I forget what it was. Anyway, the language model was really simple in the sense that, we had some digits in the last sentence. The last digit was always an even number or something. And so we built this. We actually got it to work in real time. It didn't work in Telluride, but the week later we got it working in Zurich. We had a little bug in the Telluride code. But it was very informative because it told us a lot about how to talk about the system and really informed my thinking about attention and salience and cognition and how all these things worked. And I thought it was very valuable. These are the kind of results we got. It's a little complicated, but just to give you a sense, the top figure here is showing binaural presence of sounds. So the bottom line of things is stuff on the one side, and the top part is the other side. So these 2 ears, and so you can see, and so you can see the digit starting. So there's a digit, and then sort of flopping between the 2 ears as the sentences are spoken. The middle graph is showing the computed salience. So we have green and blue impulses, if you will, at the start of each word from the left side and the right side. And this cognition box had to look at the binaural signals coming in, left and right, and then had to tell the recognizer, look to the left, look to the right. Because the recognizer can only look, the recognizer, the brain, the cognition can only look at one side or the other side. And so then we looked at multiple strategies for driving this system. And this is where it kind of flaky. But it helped us talking about it. So here the system was looking, I don't remember which one's which. I could probably figure it out. So this, let's see. So this blue line, so it went dark gray when the blue line went. So I guess that was the male speaker, and the male speaker was on the bottom there. So anyway, so you can track it all through. And it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. We got these kind of results. The distracted case was where whenever something happened, it immediately switched attention to that side. It's sort of the squirrel effect, people that get distracted easily. So the distracted case, it did very poorly in this task. But then if you do something smarter, and the smart was of the idea that if you start hearing something, look at that first digit and decide whether it's high value or not. So the rule was if the first digit was 5 or greater, then stay where you are. But if you've only heard a 1 or a 2, then go ahead and switch, because it's quite likely the next digit you hear, the other side will be higher value. And again, this is all trying to model how you guys switch between attention to different things. But again, abstracting is this very simple thing, and that was very useful. I want to talk about some stuff I did at Microsoft, which, yeah.
Sorry, some questions for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
So are the two speeches synchronized?
No.
Okay. Are you returning to the highest value in the speed?
Well, yes, well, so you might know that Greg says more intelligent things than I do, and so you attend to Greg more than me because historically you know he's had higher value. But this system was, had a very short history, and so it just sort of switched between them. But yes, in a real system, you would know that one person has better value than another person, or there's a topic you're more interested in than another topic. This didn't consider any of those issues.
The performance metric you have that's at the end of the whole segment, or that's at each time you say?
That was that was at the end of each sentence. Let's see. Actually, I don't remember the specifics. It was counting how many of the high value sentences it got. But then since they weren't synchronous, I don't remember how we did that. Anyway, it's fairly arbitrary. I mean, this is a very contrived test.
So when you talk about the language model, is that the model generating a number of sentences, or what? So basically, how did...
Well, the language model was important because we had to know when the sentence ended.
So that was just in the detect.
Yeah.
So did the people that come up with the raw numbers?
Oh, no, this was all synthetic.
And was it supposed to be basically uniform on both sides? I mean, was there something that...
Oh, yeah.
may have gotten a good strategy? Or
Oh, no, you're right. So the digit sequences on either side were numerically balanced. I mean, one side wasn't better than the other side. So we generated these sentences, and then they could have been either side. I want to talk a little bit about some stuff we did at Microsoft a few years ago when I was there. I was working with Dilika Kanitur and Gökhan and Andreas Solke. And we did a bunch of stuff on how can you use eye gaze to improve speech recognition. And the answer is attention. I mean, you want to know what people are attending to because that helps you understand what they might be saying. And that's a very powerful signal. We had a bunch of different signals we could use. People could point, which is kind of painful when you're holding your hand out. So people didn't like to do that. You can look at eye gaze. So these screens are big enough and eye tracking is becoming cheap enough that you can actually look and see what people are looking at. And I'll talk about some results with eye tracking. And for really large screens, eye tracking doesn't work well because you can move around and you're far enough from the screen. And we actually got good data with just face pose. So it's not as good as eyes, but face pose worked pretty well. I should say that a lot of people use eye tracking and say, well, we can use it for controlling things. And so there's this person who's got a disease and he can move his eyes, but he can't do other kinds of pointing. And he's very good at using his eye to make language. But that's not something that most people want to do. It's very painful. Eyes are designed for gathering information, not for pointing or not for controlling things. So as my friend Suman's eye said, it's unnatural to overload a perceptual channel, such as vision, with a motor control task. You can do it if you have to, but it's not what it's designed for. And Toby, who does these eye tracking systems, has this absolute brilliant video game that they use for demonstrations. It's really amazing. It's an asteroid game. It's a shooting game. And you're supposed to shoot these asteroids when they come off the screen. And it works so well because you're using eye gaze. And I just said, well, that doesn't work. You're controlling something. Well, the reason it works is because these things appear and your eyes go there. And so it's like the most natural thing in the world. You shoot down things by looking at them, and they flash, and you look, oh, there it is, and then it goes away. So it's a great gimmick for them, and it works really well. But that's not the way the real world works. And instead, you should think about eye gaze as a spotlight into what they're thinking about, what they're looking at, and what they're using. So the first thing we did was looked at some stuff with addressee detection. We were looking at human-human computer interactions. So the idea is you have a kiosk, and you have two people standing in front of it. And the two people are doing something that they need to do together, and then they're interacting with a screen. And the screen is going to try to present information that's useful to the users. So the user might be saying either direct commands to the system, say like, what's the traffic look like to the restaurant tonight? Or they might be talking about a restaurant to each other, and then the system has to say, okay, well, maybe I can add some information to the dialogue by showing some information about what they're talking about. Like, here's the restaurant menu or something like that. So unprompted, this display could do things. But we were trying to understand when people were looking at the screen, or when people were talking to the screen. And so we had this scenario set up. And there's some signals we could use, but they're all very noisy. So the graph on the bottom is showing a histogram of direction of look for one of the speakers when they were looking at the other human. So that's one on the left. The black line is to the left. And then looking at the screen. So, there's probably, 90 degrees difference between the two directions. But, when we actually look at the histogram of displays, of positions, we might see 10 degrees. It's not a very big signal. And part of that's because you don't actually have to look all the way at a person. You're not looking the whole time. It's a very messy signal. But there's a bunch of signals we could use to do that. Yeah.
Graph only for the segments before they start to indicate who they're talking to, or is this overall to the recording?
I don't remember. My guess is it's through the task. Well, yeah, because there's two different cases. One is with the human, and one is to the screen. So I think it's over the entire, and that's why it's So we looked at a bunch of different signals. Much to our surprise, prosody was the best signal, and the reason for that is bad. The reason for that is that the speech recognition was lousy, and people quickly figured out that they should talk louder to the damn computer. So it worked really well, but I consider it a bad result. And I think as speech recognition gets better, people will do that less and less often. But at least in this technology from a few years ago, prosody and loudness were the best indication of whether you're talking to a human or to the computer. Language helped a lot. So you talk differently. We built a language model for talking to the computer versus talking to the person. The language models were different, and we could use that to help decide which one you were talking to. And also, if you actually ask the question, it's like, did you mean the restaurant on Main Street? And then you could use that information to, say, help you guide what they're going to do next. And we were hoping that the visual and the acoustic beam, like which direction are they pointing when they speak, would be useful, and it contributed very little to performance. But I still think that's going to be the important cue in the future, and we just don't know how to capture the information yet. And so that was kind of neat to see. So that's at the level of detecting who you're talking to. We also looked at a more basic question: is how do you improve speech recognition using eye gaze? And again, you might not think it's obvious how that works, but in a lot of these scenarios, you're going to be looking at a screen, you're going to be getting information from a screen, and the screen is going to inform what you're going to say next. And so we wanted to capture that information. We wanted to capture what you're looking at and use that to make a prediction. We did a Wizard of Oz experiment. We had an intern come in, and he set up this experiment. He had like 20 tasks for people to do. And one of the tasks was find this obscure boat registration form on the Department of Motor Vehicles website. Things like that, or find a concert tickets. There are various tasks that were realistic but kind of weird. And we had it set up with eye tracking, and they had the screen and they had the eye tracker, and the experimenter was the wizard. So he was behind a screen, and he said, just from looking at the eye tracks, because he's looking at the eye tracks in real time, just from looking at the eye tracks, he knew what their question was going to be. So, I mean, he sort of knew where they were going, and so he sort of knew what was coming next. But just from the eye tracks alone, ignoring the audio, he knew what was coming. And so we were trying to build a system that would take that into account. And this was these are some eye tracking data for a study we did collecting data where we asked people to just pick a sentence from the web page and read it aloud. And so they were going to look at the page of text, find something they liked, read it back to us, and then go on. And these are the eye tracks that we got for that. And I forget where it started, but basically, I think it started here. But basically, after the first word, their eyes were already somewhere else. So they figured out what they're going to say. They started preparing the vocal track, preparing the words, and their eyes were off somewhere else. And so it's an interesting signal because it changes with over time. And so one of the things we had to understand was, how does this spotlight change in time and space? And so we modeled it as a spotlight. There's a radius and a time and all that kind of stuff involved in that. Excuse me. The best way to do this system would be to build a language model that's predicated on your gaze. So you're looking at the section of the travel page that talks about destinations. Well, then you might want to modify the language model to only show destinations or make that more prominent. And we didn't have access to the system at that level, but what we could do is rescore things. So we had a very generic language model. Actually, it was actually page specific, so we weren't cheating. We knew what words were on the page, and so we had a language model that had all those words. And then once we got the recognition from that out, we got the n-best lattice out, and then we built another. Used the lattice model, the lattice data to rescore it based on the eye gaze. And so the results I'm talking about are this two-step process. For example, you might get this kind of lattice where this is a test sentence, but the person is looking at the word "the" when they're doing it. It's a very contrived example. And so what you really want to do is recognize this other path. And we can do that all probabilistically, and it can change the weight between the visual and the acoustic to get the performance we need to get. I think the best way to talk about the performance is in terms of perplexity. Perplexity, as you probably mostly know, is this idea of given any word, how many words come next. And the large vocabulary recognition system at Microsoft at the time had a very large perplexity. This was a lot. Yeah, it was just a generic model. So I think it was just a bigram model. Maybe it wasn't even that. Actually, I'm not sure what it was. But it had a very high perplexity. It might have been a unigram model. When you added the page restriction, that got the perplexity down to 26, which is much more reasonable. And then when you added gaze, it went down to 15. And if you added page and gaze, it got down to 14. So in a sense, the eye gaze information cut your perplexity by a factor of 2. If you will, it made the speech recognition problem half as hard, twice as easy. And that shows up in these error rates, although it's a little harder to talk about them. So we got a 10% relative error rate reduction compared to the baseline. The baseline was the whole page language model, but then knowing which part of the page you're looking at, we could make a significant performance improvement. And so that was quite good. I think the challenging part with that is that these screens are really small, and so getting eye gaze information from smaller screens is hard. But it's getting better and better, and you can get eye tracking. You can get eye tracking software for phones now, using the camera phones. So that's becoming easier and easier. And if you look at the face pose information, this is a different experiment where we had people reading words off a screen, but they appeared suddenly. So we're looking at people's ability to follow, to find the information. But by doing it this way, we could actually measure the latency between when the eyes got there and when the head got there. And so in this particular example, we saw So 0 is where the word appeared, 0 seconds. The eye gaze followed maybe a third or half second later, and then the face followed a full second after the start. And then the people started talking. It was the same kind of task, so people started talking a little after a second in this case. So, we got data. It wasn't quite as accurate as eye gaze, but again, for these big screens, eye gaze isn't possible, so face pose is a useful signal. And so we were happy for that result. These are the kind of latencies we measured. I assume the negative ones are just people looking at, their faces moving around. But on the order of a third of a second, their faces were following their eyes. And so again, faces can provide a signal about attention. And so that was useful, and we hope we can use that. And then the face pose wasn't inaccurate. But I like to say that the perplexity went up by about 30%. So eye gaze gets you down by a factor of 2, and then face pose is up by 30% from that. So, it's still useful information, not as good as you'd like. And I don't have the video for this, but we built this little demo. It's really hard to demonstrate this. It's really hard to demonstrate 30% improvements in error rate or 20% improvements in error rate. But we had this example where we had all these words that were very similar acoustically. And it's obviously very contrived. Recognized speech and recognized speech sound very similar. And we looked at a place, the Microsoft homepage mentioned Microsoft Office like 6 different times, but they're in different contexts. So you might recognize Microsoft Office, but depending on which part of the page you're looking at, you might do different actions. So here, these are exactly the same phonemes, but you want to do different things depending on where they're looking at. And again, in email, sent and send are different commands. And so acoustically, they're very different. But depending on where your task and what you're looking at, that's useful information. And what the demo shows, and I lost the video, the light blue box in the bottom is showing what it recognized from the acoustic case. And so in this particular case, I very clearly said recognize speech. And it recognized speech like it should have acoustically. But the whole time I was doing that, I was saying recognize. I was looking at the top box. And you can see all the dots are the eye tracking data. So I'm looking at the top one and saying recognize speech. And the system, was biased to trust the system biased in a way that trusted the eye gaze more in this case. And so again, we could show good performance, and that was quite fun. And then the final level of this is can you improve speech understanding? So we know that you're talking to the computer, we can recognize the words better, and now can you inform the dialogue task? Can you help understand speech better? Again, the idea being that we want to be in this paradigm where you're talking to the screens and you actually want to do tasks. And so I'm not a dialogue person. I was working with Dilek on this. So this is my view of the dialogue world. But the idea is you want to, given some words that you've recognized, you want to turn that into a task. You want to turn that into an actual operation the computer's going to do. And speech recognition has errors, and that makes it very difficult. And as I understand it, there's all sorts of ways of doing the dialogue management, understanding filling the slots and taking care of that. And we looked at a bunch of different approaches for combining the eye gaze information. Heuristical and heat map were the 2 ways of doing it. Excuse me. The heuristics are heuristics. They're really but they work. Are things like, given eye gaze, how far is the eye gaze from different action words on the screen? So this is a distance thing. Actually, I don't remember what these things were anymore. They're all fairly arbitrary. But they mostly worked. The thing that worked better was a heat map. For those of you who don't live in the search engine world, this is actually a very typical example of how people look at a web page. So the dark red is where you look at most. And so people, when they see a search page, automatically go look in the upper left because you've all been well trained because that's supposedly the best results. Anyway, this is fairly typical for that. The language results look like this, and I'll just highlight a few of them. So the heuristics helped by 10% in the F scores from the gaze. The new heat map worked even better, so it went from 26% to 38%. And then if you add all the features together, you get the final improvement. And so, it helps. It's good. So this is the bottom line on the speech recognition with eye gaze and attention. With eye gaze, we got 10% improvement in error rate, which is nothing to laugh at in the speech recognition world. In a dialogue understanding case, we got a 17% increase, although I think this is harder to talk about this because it's so task dependent. And we saw very little improvement in the addressee detection, but I heard about some work earlier today that I think will help with that, and I think that'll get a lot better. And we were also looking at things like conversational dynamics and trying to understand the conversation and doing things like that. And we had an intern from LP Morenzi's group, and I shouldn't name names because it's the only intern I've ever had who failed at a project, but it wasn't because of the intern, it's just because it was really hard. So we didn't have any success there. I wanted to talk about the signals we have and how we look at the science involved in this. And there's people in this room that understand saliency much better than I do. But at least I wanted to contrast a few approaches that I think are interesting, because I think what saliency is still to be debated. The eye tracking world has this wonderful signal. I'm sorry, the visual world has this amazing signal called eye tracks. It's not 100% indicative of what you're paying attention to, but it's a really good signal. And so this is some old data, 67, I guess, of people looking at this figure, and you can see they spend a lot of time looking at the eyes and the mouth and the neck and the outline, and a little bit of time at the ear, not nearly enough time at the ear. But you can't do this for audio. We don't have a signal for audio that tells us what you're attending to. Or at least we haven't found a good signal. And I'm really interested in what that looks like, and I really like to know what that looks like. A lot of this work is motivated by Laurent Eady's work. Actually, I don't, and Ernst Niebuhr, who I guess is not here today. And they built this model that is a hack, but it works, and people have developed it over the years. And there's a lot of data out there, and people have been able to refine the model in really good ways. And I think we actually have a pretty good models on the visual side. And we're trying to figure out what to do with the auditory side. I'm sorry, there's just a bunch of details of things it combines. And it can make a decision about what you're going to look at next. And it gets some quality. It does pretty well. Christoph Kaiser, a number of years ago, did the first auditory experiment. It was an amazingly simple experiment, but it worked. And even more impressively, he got it working in both humans and monkeys. So I'm amazed that he did both sides. And he asked people which sounds are more salient. So these are the kind of sounds he had. So was the first one or the second one more salient? I mean, it's fairly arbitrary, but he asked people, and he got monkeys to do the same task, and he got data, and that was a start. And I don't mean to denigrate in any way, but it's great that he did it, but we can do better. Here at Johns Hopkins, you guys have been. I haven't gotten the latest update, so this is old. But the way I think about the work here is you've done these amazing experiments on looking at discriminability, and so various kinds of sounds and various kinds of features, and trying to use that data, trying to collect that data, saying, okay, does pitch matter more than intensity? And trying to get some basic data about what sounds are salient and how that works together. And so that's useful data. When I was at Yahoo, we did a more task-oriented experiment. And this was based on the idea that people are using for CAPTCHAs. So this idea of testing for human abilities instead of robots. And we did this with numbers. And so we asked people to recognize these numbers, sequences. 2, 9, 1, 5, 7. I should write down the numbers next time so I don't have to do it by ear. Anyway, we collected some data. I'm not convinced that's the right approach. And I'm also, I'm more intrigued right now with some data that Maria has been doing at UCL, and I've been helping her with some experiments. And the idea is you want to look at two sounds and say whether they're the same or not. And the reason I like it is because it's a very task-oriented condition in the sense that there's a distractor in the middle. And so this distractor, if it's doing its job right, will distract you, and you'll forget what's going on between the first and the last. So these are the kind of sounds that Maria's looking at. So those are the same. No distractor, or very minimal distractor. There's different. And then is this the same or different? And I like this approach because it gets at the basic essence of attention, which is, are you attending or are you being distracted? And I think the jury's still up in the air, and I'm sure Mooney and I will have vigorous discussions about this later. But I think it's a really important problem, and we need to figure out what's going on. Do we care more about distractions or detectability? And what's the right answer? And we're trying to get to that. I want to talk a little bit about attention, just a couple things. This is old work that we did in Telluride. We started in Telluride, and Ed Lawler finished the work in Dublin. The normal way, in Telluride, we were doing a lot of work on EEG decoding and trying to understand EEG signal and trying to connect it to the audio experience, so that given an audio signal, we can predict the EEG, or more reliably, given an EEG, we can say something about the audio. So the inverse problem is harder, or easier rather. So the normal way of doing BCI is you put some sort of stimulus in front of a person, you measure the brain waves and say, oh, that was a dog. We're trying to do something more interesting, which is we have two sources, and the user's paying attention. And what we want to do is understand which sound the person is attending to. So in our case, we had two audio stimuli. They're both male speakers, so it's not overlapping pitch. The person listening to it, he was I guess in this he or she was being told, listen to the left side, listen to the right side, or listen to the C1, or listen to the center of the earth. It was both dyadic and dichotic. So we got all these EEG signals. We built a decoder, and then we wanted to say which one they're attending to. So we're trying to, this is unseen by us, we're trying to predict it from the EEG signal. This is where I find it interesting, because there's both an engineering and science problem in this. From the engineering point of view, we just want to know which one they're attending to. Are you listening to speech or music? From the scientific point of view, I really, really, really want to understand how attention works and how it works in the brain. And my model is that one signal goes all the way up in the brain. It's being fully processed. You're thinking about it. You're attending to it. It's going into your model, a memory of the story. And this other signal that you're not attending to goes part way up, and then something happens to it. And I draw it with these two different arrows saying how high it goes, which is obviously a cartoon. But it seems to be consistent with the model results, in the sense that we can do a better job predicting the attended signal than we can the unattended signal. So this unattended signal is much noisier. There's not as much signal there. So we get these signals, we build a decoder, and then we can say, where does the signal stop? How does it work? And that works. These are the kind of results that Ed showed in his paper. The blue line is decoding accuracy over 60 seconds. So this is a single trial, but 60 seconds of data. And it's sorted in terms of how good we are at that subject. So some subjects we were very good at, one subject we were very bad at. And then the red line is showing how good we were at decoding the same person's unattended speech. So the red line is generally below the blue line, saying that it's harder to decode the unattended speech. And here's the same data plotted by how long the look was. So with 10 seconds, we could do a pretty good job on most speakers. I'm sorry, most subjects, we do a pretty good job understanding which side they're attending to. And then there's one guy that was difficult. And then the other thing which completely surprised me, this was not my idea. If you'd asked me this, I would have said it wasn't going to work, but Ed did it anyway in Dublin, and it worked amazingly well. So, sorry, this is a very complicated graph, and you probably don't have to understand all of it. But they looked at people's performance on a comprehension test to the thing they were attending to. So they're told to listen to 20,000 leagues. They're attending to it, their brainwaves were attending to it, they could decode it. And then we asked them afterwards some questions about what they just heard. It turned out, this is amazing to me, it turned out that performance on the decoding task was highly correlated with performance on the comprehension task, which is really pretty amazing. I'm amazed at this, that it worked. This is sort of like the ideal scientific case where you got these two different things that are correlated. and it worked really well. And so, people that are interested in how students are attending and stuff like that, this could be useful information for them. I want to talk about this because this is not my, yeah, go ahead.
So I was going to ask, so even though whether or not they were attending this person, it's a binary thing in the sense that you ask them to attend.
Right.
But whether they or not they did, you don't know, but you apparently can measure by how well you can decode.
Right. Well, it's kind of it's partly based on their brain, because some people can decode better than others, and partly it's based on how well they're following the instructions.
So I guess that's the observation. So there's this thing where you don't observe, you only observe the part,
Yeah.
and you know what they're instructed to do, but you don't know explicitly to what degree they
Right. Yeah. The other view of this kind of experiment is the stuff that Lucas Parra is doing at NYU, where he shows a video to people and measures their EEG and says, how well correlated is person A and person B? And he says, oh, look, if they're really engaged, like when the gun comes out, look, their EEGs match up really well. It's just kind of a similar thing. But the thing that I think Lucas is missing, and what has to be done next, is I suspect that there's populations that pay attention to one thing versus another thing. So at the very simplest, male and females probably pay attention to different things in a movie. And so you might see high correlation between the males and high correlation with the females, and high correlations with everybody when the gun comes out. But he hasn't done those experiments yet.
So maybe this is the simple interpretation of the result, namely that you instruct them to attend to one or the other, and you don't know whether they do it or not, and your EEG-based decoder tells you with some accuracy which one they're paying attention to, and if they're really listening to your instructions, you would do a better job detecting it.
Right.
And the comprehension is a proxy for whether or not they were listening.
Yeah.
So I think this is a simple explanation. I think the more complex one is that their ability to pay attention may be governed by their comprehension.
Oh, well, that's the whole circle again. Thank you.
So I think that might be what's also going on, if not
Yeah.
what might be what really is going on.
Yeah, that's probably fair to say.
If you're understanding what's going on, you're able to pay attention.
Yeah. It's that damn feedback loop. I completely agree. And I guess we'd use numbers, that would have been a problem, but we didn't want to use numbers.
Or the other way around, their ability to understand correlates with how well they can encode the signal.
Right.
Maybe they're having a hard time encoding it, and decoding it and understanding.
Maybe I should have the video camera turned off, but Steve Grossberg has lots of issues, but one thing he was right about is there's all these feedback loops, and Steve was didn't do a very good job explaining it. But we really have to pay attention to these loops, and expectations drives perception, and perception drives expectations, and you think it's very unlikely that I'm going to say the word elephant, but now you do, and so you can expect elephant again. Only no more so than what you would expect from normal aging. I mean, comprehension's harder, cocktail party is harder with older. I don't think this basic result would change. I mean, we have no evidence of the fact that decoding is harder for young versus old. But there's still all the issues with cocktail party and elderly.
There's some more Jonathan Simon's been looking at the
Oh, right.
yes, so there's definitely an attenuation.
Is there?
Yes, noisier.
Is it tied to task performance, or is it independent, or is it?
But I do know that the signals were attenuated because it's a little lower, so
So I'll have to ask him about that. I forgot about that. But if I had to predict, I would say that task performance would be most of the explanation. But I'll ask him. Hopefully I'll see him tomorrow. Oops. Hopefully I'll see him tomorrow. I want to talk about this because I think it's really, really important. This is not my work. It was done by my friends in Berkeley. This is actually, I should have put this. This is in the paper, but I'm pretty sure this came from Irv Hafter. He said that some listeners claim a subjective improvement from noise reduction, yet it has not been shown to improve the quantitative intelligibility. So this is sort of backwards. I mean, most technology shows things to be more optimistic than they are. Speech recognition works better than it. I mean, lots of things work better in the lab than they do in real life. And in this case, speech enhancement is showing not much improvement, if anything. I mean, it's not showing much benefit. Yet people still say it sounds better. It sounds, they like it better. And Irv was asking the question. I think Irv was the motivating factor for this study. Irv was saying, why? Why could they possibly like it?
I'm not sure I understand what I is, because on its face it doesn't make sense. I just turn up the noise, I can eliminate any intelligibility.
Right. This is modifying the signal in ways to reduce the noise, and L2 norms or speech recognition might show one result, and yet people have a preference. And this isn't just subjective bias because it's experiment, or this is double blind. People still prefer this because, and we don't know why. It doesn't show up in the numbers. And what I want to talk about is something called listening effort, which is what Irv and his colleagues in Berkeley argue is really important part of all these speech processing systems. And that's why I showed this. This is effort. And some things are easier to understand than others. So I'm speaking very loudly, which hopefully makes it easy for you to understand me, and you put less effort into it. But if you're a non-native speaker of English, you're probably working harder to understand what I say than native speakers. And so that's listening effort. The way that Irv and his colleagues did the task is with a dual task. The experiment was a dual task experiment. And the idea is that if you have two tasks that are completely independent, talking and walking, then your performance in either task is at the ceiling, and they're independent of each other. So I can talk, I can walk. It doesn't really affect my performance on those two tasks. But if you ask me to tap my head and rub my belly or whatever, I can't do both those at the same time. And so there's a lot of tasks that there's some internal limit on how well you can do them. And so if you ask people to do the task, they'll fall somewhere on this line. And they can either do task 1 really well and task 2 not at all, or the other way around, or something in the middle. And so you can diagnose how things are working based on this. So they did one of these tasks, and they did a couple tests, but I think this is the one that's easier to explain. So they asked people to listen to these sentences. The fruit peel was cut in thick slices. They were embedded in noise. Forced speakal babble, 3 different signal-noise ratios. So these are very difficult tasks. And they did a very standard noise reduction algorithm known as FMALA, which is sort of a really good baseline, old but really good baseline. And the primary task was to repeat the sentence. So they had to listen to this thing, and they had to say it back to the system. And at the same time, they had to look at a screen and type a digit into a box when it appeared on the screen. So type the digit, and in the secondary task and the primary task were uncorrelated. And what we want to do is measure the reaction time. So, either task by itself is fairly taxing. Together, it's a really hard task, and we wanted to look at performance, or they wanted to look at performance. These are the results I got. On the primary task, unprocessed, is in open circles, processes in dark circles. And as a function of signal-noise ratio, performance didn't vary very much with processing. So their ability to recognize a speech and repeat it back to the person wasn't changed very much. It went down with signal-noise ratio going down, but the noise processing didn't make much difference. So that's the primary task. That's just repeat the sentences back. At the same time, people were looking at the screen and having to recognize the screen and then type a number in a box. And that's where they got an interesting difference. So at reasonable, 2 and minus 2 dB SNR, the reaction time didn't differ very much. But there were significant differences in the reaction time at the lowest signal-noise ratio. So in the processed case, it was 680 milliseconds. In the unprocessed case, it was 73, 74 milliseconds. For the visual task, for the typing task. So this is consistent with the observation that started the study in the sense that the noise processing didn't help recognition any. This is human recognition. You didn't get a significant difference here, but yet there was a lot more processing power left over for the human, and they could do the task much better. They could do the secondary task much easier. And so I think as those of us that design speech systems, build systems, we can't just look at signal-noise ratio. We can't just look at these arbitrary numerical methods, because the brain is really good at doing a lot of things. And my colleague Dick Lyon likes to say, a lot of the things that we can do in noise enhancement algorithms are things the brain does for free anyway. So it doesn't really help you in performance anyway. But it still takes processing power. And so you might prefer to have them done for you, but it might not show up in any of the numerical methods. And we have to start thinking about that. This is just saying the same thing. The findings suggest that this low SNR use of a noise reduction algorithm may free up cognitive resources that would otherwise be involved in extracting speech from noise, allowing them to be allocated to other simultaneous processing tasks, like the visual side in this case. It's 12 o'clock. Can I, 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes? I want to show these results. This was an effort that Guido and I did in Telluride the last 4 or 5 days. And it was mimicking an experiment that Josh McDermott and his colleagues at MIT did. This is a picture of their slide from their ARO poster, where they looked at fMRI data and tried to correlate it with a deep neural network. So they have these texture sounds, and I lost them, I can't play them, but he has these texture sounds, 165 of them. They played them to a brain, they played them to a CNN or DNN, and they wanted to understand what was the relationship between this voxel in the brain to different layers in the deep neural network. And I'm not going to try to repeat his results. He got really interesting results, and they're working on a publication. But we wanted to do the same thing in the EEG domain. So fMRI is too easy. We have to do an EEG in Telluride. So fortunately, Ed had a student who had collected EEG signals from 6 subjects listening to these sounds in a quiet environment. So we didn't have to do that part in Telluride, which is good. And then we had a DNN model that was released over the summer from Google, where we had trained a very large deep neural network with 70 million videos, 5 million hours of audio, 30,000 classes. So this is state-of-the-art audio, environmental audio, like sirens, soccer games, classical music, snoring, whatever, and a large number of weights. And so we ran the audio through both the brain I guess it was in Rochester, and in the DNN in Telluride. And we built 2 systems to try to understand what's going on. One system was based on taking the problem we had is that you get these EEG signals. They're very long. They're very noisy. They have high sample rate. There's a lot of channels. We somehow had to evaluate how close that EEG signal was to the DNN output or the DNN layers. And so what we wanted to do is we looked at 2 different ways of. Let me do it this way. Let me go back. Sorry, rearranging slides. So we looked at 2 different ways of abstracting the information in the EEG signal and converting it into something we could compare to the DNN. So the simplest case, we took the EEG data, and I call it a spectrogram, but it's actually a spectra. So we took each EEG channel and looked at the frequency content. And the frequency we chose were things like alpha, beta, and gamma. So we had like 32 channels of frequency information. And we wanted to correlate that information with the information that was coming out of the deep neural network. And just to simplify things, we did PCA on the deep neural network thing because it had lots of channels, so we got down to a smaller thing. And used canonical correlation, which is it's a very nice way of taking 2 data sets, rotating them, each in their own direction, and then comparing them. So we don't know where the data came from, we don't know how it was set up, but CCA will find a rotation that gives us the maximum correlation. And then it finds the second correlation that does the same. I mean, it's a nice statistical way of doing that. But what this does is it allows us to take the EEG data, abstract it, take the DNN data, make it smaller, on a layer-by-layer basis, and then correlate them. And then we can see how well they correlate across the layers. So this DNN had, I think, 11 layers. And we could look at that. Guido did the work on the other side using a Siamese network. So a Siamese network is what's shown here. And what he did is he took EEG signals, 128 channels. I think this is 1 second, because that's where 256 came from. And he built a network that would take a look at these two sounds and say whether take a look at these two EEGs and say whether they came from the same sound or not. So you play a typewriter to people and they get an EEG signal. You play the typewriter sound again, you get a different EEG signal because their stomach's hungry or whatever else happened. And he wanted to train a network that would say, are these the two coming from the same sound or not? And it's a Siamese network because the weights on this side and the weights on this side are the same. And only when you get to the top does it look at them and say, oh, these are the same or different. And so what comes out of this is an embedding layer. So there's a 64-dimensional embedding layer that's at the top of the network. And that embedding layer is trained in a way that it can make the final decision as easy as possible. And so it's an embedding layer because it takes any signal and embeds it in this one. It takes any multidimensional signal, 128 by 256, and embeds it as a single number in a 64-dimensional space. And if two sounds are coming from the same sound, two EEGs are coming from the same sound, then hopefully the points will be close together. And if they're coming from different sounds, hopefully it's put them far apart. So that's what the Siamese network looks like.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So then you have 6 subjects listening to very different sounds of 180 EEG. Are they synchronized in some way with the stimulus? You know that's what it calls.
Yes. Yes.
And then when you say you take a second of this, a second of that, right? Taking the same 1 second that goes around.
Actually, I don't know in Guido's case because he did the work while I was sleeping. We were working at home at night on our own. In my case, I had 960. So the audio set has 960 millisecond frames, and I took 960 millisecond frames out of a 2-second thing. I suspect he did the same thing. So we had all these 960 millisecond chunks, and any chunk was equally good as any other chunk. But yeah, I think so. But I need to double check. So these are the results we got. The yellow bars, that's easy, that's the baseline. Actually, I forget how we did the baseline, but it was designed to mimic this. I think we just took the signals and randomized them and then put it into CCA. And what you're seeing on the bottom here are the different networks. It's actually alphabetical order, which is bad, I apologize. But look at the first 4. The dark blue or purple is the spectrogram approach. So that's where we looked at the energy in each band. And we got significant correlations. And the light green or whatever, cyan, is from the Siamese network. So we got these results, and we were really excited about it. But then we realized, and then it felt good because we got these, behaviors that made sense. And it sort of made sense that, you'd see something monotonic. But what we didn't like is the fact that they did monotonic in different directions. After we got home from Telluride, I thought about it some more and realized that they should be different in the sense that the spectrogram approach is looking at very low-level features, like how much energy is at alpha band and things like that, while the Siamese network is looking at object categories. So you might expect that the Siamese network might be better at making the high-level decisions because it's looking at sound classes. Unfortunately, the data doesn't show that. So the Siamese network got worse the farther you got into the network. I'm sorry, the correlation got worse as you got farther in the network, and the spectrogram approach got better as you got deeper in the network, which is exactly backwards from what you expect. I've redone these with air bars, and I don't have them with me, but the air bars are pretty small. So, I think the results are significant, but I don't know what to make of it. And we're now trying to understand that. But it was a fun result from Telluride, and it's the first time it's ever been done. So it was kind of neat to do that. I've had the great pleasure working with a bunch of interesting people, and I can't list them all, but these are some of the people. And Moon used to be here. I'm sorry. Oh, she is. Oh, yeah, sorry. Good. Although it's been a while since you've been to Telluride. Anyway, I benefit from a great many of interactions, which has been really wonderful. Brain Vision has been really nice to me and shipped me $50,000 worth of EEG equipment every summer. I've never met those people. I call them up and they say, sure, we'll send you $50,000 worth of equipment. So that's been really nice. And that's been great. At Microsoft, Dilek and Larry Heck. At Google, Dick Lyon, who I've worked with for many years and over several jobs. And we have a very rich community in the Bay Area of people connected to the Stanford Hearing Seminar and Berkeley's Ear Club. including Brandon Edwards, who's just now left, and Irv, and Azim Khalini, who's at Sony and did some nice work. And that's what I wanted to talk about. But I hope you guys will remember the loop. And we've had lots of fun. And I'm here today and maybe tomorrow morning, and looking forward to learning from all of you guys. Thank you.
We have a few moments for a few questions if anybody wants to ask something.
The latest results, did you correlate the EEG channels
No.
and all of them together?
We put everything in it and Josh and I were talking yesterday, Josh McDermott and I were talking yesterday, and that was one of the things I asked is, is there something intelligent about sources or sensors or something we can say about?
There's an obvious thing if you just split frontal.
Obvious for you, it wasn't for me. But yeah, we'd like to look at that. Any other questions?
Let's thank Bob again.
Thank you.